Greetings, everyone. I hope you had a nice 4th of July. Today is July 10th, 2025, and I just wanted to briefly comment on this Jeffrey Epstein case, which has become a big story in the news again recently. As you can see here, these are, headline news articles by Politico, Wall Street Journal, Newsweek, commenting on the Jeffrey Epstein case. I'm going to also give a little bit of a preview into some of the topics I'm working on. So, I don't want to spend a lot of time on this Jeffrey Epstein thing. I think you all know who he is. We're told he killed himself in his jail cell a few years back. He wasn't able to stand trial, and the client list was never released publicly, as far as I know. What is the client list? Well, we're told there's thousands of hours of footage of all kinds of children and these horrific crimes, pedophilia, women and children being exploited. But the question is, for who? Who's watching these videos? Who are these videos made for? Who's in them? Who's participating in them? Well, not one name has been given, as far as I can tell. So, I think this is bullshit. This really makes me angry. Musk, MAGA, torch Trump administration over Epstein investigation. With broken promise on Epstein, Pam Bondi draws the ire of Trump supporters. Donald Trump's response to Jeffrey Epstein question leaves MAGA stunned. If you watch a lot of my videos, you know that I don't trust the mainstream media. I hope you don't either. Even if they echo things that you feel and think that are true, I hope that you at least step back for a second and say, if my views are in line with the mainstream news media all the time, maybe I should second guess that, because the mainstream media is all about propaganda and manipulation, and they're not really there to give us the news and the truth. They're there to propagandize us. Okay, I hope you see that. Malcolm X has a famous quote, something to the degree of, if you're not careful, the newspapers will have you hating the ones being oppressed and loving the ones doing the oppressing. I don't agree on everything Malcolm X said, but I 100% agree with him on what he says about the news media, and that was a long time ago. He recognized something that's very valid, and I hope some of you think about that quote, or at least the paraphrasing of the quote I just gave you. I don't believe Jeffrey Epstein killed himself. I think that there's a huge psychological operation going on here. I think that disinformation is intentionally being sent out there, but I don't think it's being done for the wrong reasons. Now, that may sound very strange, like I'm making excuses for the Trump administration, and maybe I am. Maybe I am. I could be wrong. But if Jeffrey Epstein was working with Israel, if he was working with the Mossad, if he was working directly with Netanyahu, what would that do to just sort of reveal that casually? If the FBI director said, oh yeah, we've got Netanyahu on video, having sex with a child. I mean, on one hand, yes, we should immediately reprimand this guy. But I mean, when the guy is the supposed leader of the second most powerful, world power, that gets a little complicated. And I believe this is happening, I think that there is a huge investigation going on, which will take down the elites of this world, or at least a significant aspect of it, draining the swamp, as they say. Now, some of you may not believe that. In my humble opinion, they are putting out intentional disinformation because they are currently going after the bad guys that are far bigger than Epstein, and they want to get them, and they don't want to tell them what their plans are. They want to put out disinformation to confuse them and keep them guessing. And maybe you think that's absurd, maybe you think that's silly. So that's what I think about the Jeffrey Epstein thing. I think we're being lied to, but I think and I hope that it's being done for the right reasons. And I will just leave it at that. Some of you may have watched a video or read my blog called the Queensryche, which I go into the band Queensryche, and my theories about the motivations behind that band, and EMI Records, which is a British label that put out the Beatles, Pink Floyd, Iron Maiden, EMI, and my theory about how basically these these corporations, these record labels like EMI, they're really about influence. They're about propaganda, and they sponsor these bands in order to push whatever messages they want to get out to the culture. You know, the British invasion is a good example. Using music to sort of metaphorically invade, or maybe not so metaphorically invade a culture, because you put a band like the Beatles out into America and you push certain messages. You influence the band to say certain things, to sing about certain things, to have a certain type of music. Well, you can have an influence on a culture that way. So it's a type of warfare, actually. And so in researching Queensryche and some of their imagery and themes, I came to the conclusion that they were definitely, and probably still are, a contrived band, made up of members that are obviously real people, real musicians, real talent. I'm not taking that away from the band. I'm a big Queensryche fan, at least of their classic material and some of their newer material with Todd Latour. But I feel like any band or any person or any actor, musician that gets any sort of level of fame, they are on the radar of the powers that be. And the powers that be, their main interest is influencing the culture, because they need to control us. And, in World War II in Nazi Germany, they just simply put people in trains and took them to camps and exterminated them. But that was, as effective as that was and as horrible as that was, I think that someone high up and in charge realized that's maybe not the best way to do things. A better way to do things is to propagandize people and convince them to behave in the way you want. And in that way, they can be your slaves or destroy themselves. Ultimately, it's about control. And so after I put out the Queensryche videos and blogs, I was advised to look into this band Crimson Glory. And I'm sure most of you have probably never heard of them. But as you can see, they have some very interesting symbolism with the wearing of the masks. And their album covers are lots of occult symbolism on the cover of the albums. And, the singer Midnight, he's got pictures of himself covering one eye. And there's just a lot of weird, like, Illuminati kind of creepy, part of that whole faction going on with Crimson Glory. The singer Midnight actually died, I think it was in 2009, and it was replaced by Todd Latour, who is now in Queensryche. And just to back up for a second, I have this theory, which I call the Reap J. Lamb theory, that any band that gets any kind of fame, they need to make some kind of sacrifice, and it's usually a human sacrifice. And when I play this game and I think about a band where they're all still alive, like Black Sabbath or Queensryche, it gets very interesting when you go down that road and you ask yourself, well, if nobody in the band was sacrificed, then who was? And I theorize that side projects are what this is for. For example, I believe that the whole reason Audioslave was formed, and that Rage Against the Machine, quote unquote, took a break, was that so Chris Cornell could collaborate with the members of Rage Against the Machine, quit, go back to Soundgarden, get sacrificed, and then voila, he becomes the sacrifice for Soundgarden, and for Rage Against the Machine by way of his collaboration with, Tom Morello and company in Audioslave. So I'm beginning to think that singer Midnight, this guy here, was actually the sacrifice for Queensryche by way of Todd Latour. And that may sound kind of confusing, but the way it works is when the person dies or is sacrificed, there must be a lot of fanfare. It's very public, and there is a connection made between this person and the band that they're being sacrificed for. And I think Todd Latour is the connection there. So I'm going to talk about that more in a future blog. Something else I'm looking into right now is I'm reading a couple books by this guy, Thomas Sowell. And he put out this book called Social Justice Fallacies. If you're interested in, the racial relations in the United States and the propaganda and what's going on and how people think about race and stuff, I think he's probably the most important person alive that we have right now. I would strongly encourage you to look into his writings and watch his videos. Now, he's a very divisive person. There's people that really don't like him. And I think the main reason people don't like him is because I think a lot of people in America, can't speak for the whole world, but I think in America, a lot of people have an attachment to this idea of inequality and racism in America. And they have a really hard time letting go of it. And Thomas Sowell has the uncanny ability to shatter those basic beliefs about social injustice in America. And he does it in a way that's very basic, very simple, and very sober, and very fact-based, and very grounded in reality. And if you've watched a lot of my videos before, you know that I have strong opinions about this. I have a passion about this topic because I feel that the main tactic of the great oppressor, who I call it generically, the powers that be in the United States, the number one tool they use to divide the society is race. And they want to divide us and get us hating each other. And they want us focusing on, topics in the past and anything they can bring up to make us hate each other because we are different races. We have different color skin. And they will actually emphasize cultural differences and even invent cultural differences that maybe didn't exist before, enhance them in order to further create more distance between whites and blacks, and not just whites and blacks, but that's just the most stark example, because they want us to embrace our separate cultures so that there is more of a gap between us, so that we identify more with our culture than we do with being human, which we have a lot more in common than we do not. And when we identify too much with culture and we buy too much into the media, who love to emphasize these cultural differences, and they always wrap it up in this beautiful package of like, oh, we're celebrating diversity and we're celebrating different cultural norms. But what they do is they amplify it so that to create strife and to enhance differences in the culture, to divide us so that they can conquer us and control us more easily. So this is something I'm looking into right now that I will do a longer blog on in the future. You ever have an idea or develop a perspective on something that that you sort of came up with yourself, and then like a week later or a year later you saw someone else talking about that same thing? Mount Doom, the prophecy of the Tolkien revealed. I don't think this person ripped me off, because this book came out a good year ago, I think. But I just got to say, it was kind of odd to get into my theories about AI and the Antichrist recently. If you've been following my videos, my blogs, I've been talking about this. I've been talking about my theory that the goal of AI is to give birth to the Antichrist. Well, then I stumbled across this book that came out, I think it was last year, which is not just talking about the same thing. And look at this picture. This is very similar to a picture I used. And this gets into my theories about the Antichrist and how ultimately it's man's ego in wanting to create and basically saying, we don't need you, God. We have the abilities of you. We can create ourselves, not just through sex, through natural birth, but we can actually create a human. Say, let there be light, let there be life, let there be animals, let there be this, let there be that. That's the kind of creation that mankind seems to be striving towards with AI, which ultimately I've come to believe that I think Satan is actually behind all of this. But anyway, getting back to this book. So I haven't gotten it yet. I'm going to get it. I'm going to read it. I'm a little suspect because you see a topic like this appear, which seems like out of nowhere. Okay, and that doesn't mean it's out of nowhere. Maybe you just weren't paying attention. But you see a topic like this, which is very esoteric, but you suddenly realize that all kinds of podcasters are talking about it and interviewing the author, and everything's very high quality. And I get suspicious because I feel like it makes me think it's a psychological operation. So I just need to put that out there. Just because a suspected psychological operation agrees with what I feel like I came with independently on my own, doesn't mean that it isn't still a psychological operation. Maybe I'm mistaken. Maybe I'm on the wrong track. But I do think there is something to this. And it's quite fascinating, especially if you're a fan of Tolkien. Because this guy's basically saying that J.R.R. Tolkien knew about this AI agenda and was trying to express it in his stories here, which I previously took as more or less pagan. What I feel is Norse mythology, although Tolkien was known to be a contemporary of C.S. Lewis, who is a well-known Christian. And C.S. Lewis wrote Chronicles of Narnia, which is thought to have a Christian leaning. Paul List, this is the author of the book, and his helper Ali Ghaffari, who apparently converted to Catholicism in the process of working with Paul List. The whole story on this book is a little creepiness around it. I'm not, as I said, I don't know if I quite buy into the whole thing, but it's very compelling what is being presented. Just to summarize some of the brief anecdotes that I heard was, the one ring to rule them all was, the one ring is round, 0, 1, 0. That's the digital language, ones and zeros. How the whole, the other world that it takes you into when you put the ring on, turns you invisible, sort of takes you into virtual reality. What Sauron represents, that, I always thought that the cloning of the orcs, the Burekai, the super orcs by Saruman, I always found that a bit almost too modern, the way it was depicted. It makes me think of like genetic engineering and, perhaps even the Nephilim of the Old Testament. There's something kind of a little bit too modern about what's going on in Lord of the Rings. This eye, this all-seeing eye, feels like it represents, the fact that there's facial recognition everywhere, that, not just social media, but our phones are following everything we say and think, and that we can sort of be found and everything about us be known, no problem, by the powers that be. There's something very compelling and plausible, I think, about the idea that Tolkien perhaps was warning about AI. So I plan to get this book and talk about it more. let me know what you think about any of these topics. You can comment in the comment section, or you can email me, tinfoilhatfashion@protonmail.com.